Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to FSU Coach Live. My name is Tim Baghurst, and today's guest is Chelsea Ale. She is a diving coach, has worked in collegiates, also worked with Olympic athletes. Chelsea, thanks so much for joining me. I'm really excited about this one because we've never had a diver or diving coach on the show, so I'm interested to learn more. Tell us a little bit about how you got into it.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here and share the sport of diving because I know it doesn't get a lot of publicity and stuff like that. So it's very nice. So my diving career started a long time ago. I was a gymnast and a swimmer, and my dad moved us across the country, and we went to go sign up for gymnastics, and there was nowhere to do it. We went to go sign up for swimming and saw diving boards, and I was like, oh, I could combine the two sports together. So when I was 9 years old, I basically decided I was going to become a diver and then became obsessed with it ever since. Trains, I wanted to be an Olympian, so that was my goal. And I basically started diving at 9, continuing just kind of focused on that sport solely ever since then. And I actually started coaching when I was 14 to sort of help offset the cost of diving and how expensive it was, and basically just continued coaching for most of my life.
You said diving is expensive. Most people would probably question that because, I mean, it's just a pool, right? There's no equipment. Why was it expensive, or why is it expensive?
So diving's expensive for a couple of things. Renting out a facility is very expensive when you're renting out a pool to use. And for diving programs, you have to have the ratio for coach to be very small to make sure that the athletes get the proper attention that they need. So if you're swimming, you can put 50 kids in a pool and have one coach give them a set and they'll be fine. But with diving, you don't really want to have more than 8 kids per coach. And then if you're renting out a facility to use for diving or to use a diving pool, that costs a lot per hour to use. Sometimes it can cost upwards of $200 or $300 per hour. So
Hmm.
you have to make sure that you have the good coach to athlete ratio, and also make sure that you're able to pay your coaches that they're able to afford to be able to do that. And then also traveling to competitions. We basically, when you go to most competitions, it lasts for 2 to 10 days. So that includes staying, like the travel, paying for coaches to travel, paying for your hotel, your food, the actual meet entries. Each event you do is about $25 to $100, depending on what competition you're doing for the each event that you're in. And you can do between 1 to maybe 5 events, depending on the actual competition. So it doesn't seem like it'd be a sport that is very expensive because you just basically need a pool and a diving board. But you also need a bunch of equipment like trampolines, mats. You need all sorts of things like that. So it just ends up adding up. And because the ratio for coaches to athletes is so small, it makes it a lot more expensive for those athletes that are doing it.
And you said 1 to 5 events. We're talking about springboard, we're talking about platform, different heights. And then all of a sudden, if it's $50, $100 per event, you're getting a very serious entry fee there.
Yeah, so you have 1 meter springboard, 3 meter springboard, and then platform. And then if you do synchronized diving, you can also do synchronized 3 meter or synchronized platform as well. So not every competition has those options, but they are there for some of them. So when you go to national championships, those last about 10 days long, and then you're having an entry fee for each event as well.
NCAA have diving as a sport, and you talked about the challenges of visibility right at the beginning in discussing this. Why do you think diving is not more recognized or maybe more appreciated given what you've seen in diving?
I think part of it comes with the marketing that we don't have for diving. It is really interesting. If you look at the Olympics, diving is one of the most watched sports in the Olympics. So every
It
four
is.
years, people are obsessed with gymnastics and Olympics. But when the Olympics are not taking place, people still care about gymnastics. They still follow like Simone Biles and things like that. But you don't actually see diving broadcasted anywhere. It's never on ESPN. It's never out in the media. And so I think part of it is just a lack of marketing and a lack of media attention that it gets. I think it can be hard in the way that dive meets work is you do one dive, then everyone does a dive, then you do another dive and everyone does a dive. So if you're only trying to watch one athlete, you're sitting in an event for maybe upwards of 5 hours. Now,
Mm.
granted, for those larger events, you're actually going to have a smaller window of competition. So, like, NCAA championships, there's not 50 divers competing. But diving events, each event can take up to 5 hours, which can get pretty boring for someone who doesn't actually care about the sport to watch. I do think it is a fascinating sport, especially at the higher elite levels, and I wish it got the recognition that gymnastics gets too, even at the NCAA level.
Yeah, and part of that may be just because the gymnastics is more of a team event, and so you have more competitors going, right? Because in gymnastics, you do your one event, wait for everybody else, then move on to your next event. Do you, I don't know really how to ask this question, but what if you were in charge and you had the power to change things, what would you do to make diving more visible? Because we know people watch it. My wife and I watch it when it's in the Olympics. We love watching the diving, but we, as you said, we never see it anywhere else. How do we change that? What do you think needs to change in order for us to, oh look, there's the NCAA's. Let's go watch the NCAA diving competition.
Well, I think Red Bull Cliff Diving right now is doing a phenomenal job of getting themselves out there and promoting their sport. So it's a growing sport. I mean, it's still diving, but it's a completely separate type of diving. And they have used social media to just sort of expand it and get it exciting. They follow the athletes, they have the athletes be representatives for their sport. They're constantly posting live videos, they're posting different social media accounts. They're following each athlete through the process of the competitions. And I think that that's something that regular USA diving is lacking, and that we're not actually having live events. So it would be really cool if online you could have these live events and people from all over the world could watch diving, because then they might say, oh, that's exciting, as opposed to having to go in person to watch it. It might also be beneficial to follow certain athletes and sort of experience their journey with them and see what they're doing. And I think that diving gets a little bit of posts here and there, but the only people that seem to actually pay attention to those are the people who already care about the sport. So Red Bull has definitely used marketing to really help expand them and make it this really exciting, cool feature that people travel all over the world to see. And I just don't think we're doing that. So if I were to have kind of a say in it, I would definitely focus on the marketing aspect and really try and highlight that. And then also, some, like I said, some of our events take a little bit longer. If we had little events that were just kind of quicker, but that were little, I guess, teasers to sort of get people excited about it, and then get people excited to actually showing up to competitions, I think that would be more fun too. So even just having little events within our larger events to kind of promote it.
You said something very important, which was Red Bull,
Mm.
and that equals cash, right? And that makes a big difference when it comes to promotion and investing in social media and things like that. Are diving athletes typically a higher income group, a lower income group? Where do they fit in SES? And is diving a financially successful sport?
So I would say divers are not financially successful at all. It's definitely not a sport that you're going to get into because you want to make money. Like, in golf, you can make a lot of money, or basketball or football, but diving, you do it because you love it, because you're excited about it. You're definitely not doing it for the money. Those athletes that do actually get some type of income from their governing bodies do not make typically livable wages where they can actually just do that as their career, their full-time job. They have to come up with some other way to offset those costs. Um, and as far as the actual governing bodies, that is one of the issues. USA Diving currently does not have a lot of money. And when everything happened with all the lawsuits and everything, it made it hard for sponsorships to actually want to attach to sports like gymnastics or diving, because they didn't want to have their brand recognition associated with that. So it's definitely made it a little bit harder to get those revenues and money coming in that way too.
Mm. Yeah, it's I think it's a real problem for any small sport. Visibility, finances. Without the visibility, you don't have the finances. Without the finances, you can't get the visibility. So it's kind of that circle effect. When you think about coaching then in diving, what are some of the great things about coaching? What are some of the challenges that you've experienced?
So I would say some of the great things are just honestly the positive impact you have on kids' lives, or people's lives in general. I mean, I think you coach the sport because you want to make the kids better and you want to make them more successful. But the thing that you get out of it is teaching them the life lessons like time management, how to set goals, how to achieve things, just teaching them accountability. And there's nothing more exciting when someone's struggling with a skill or struggling with something, and all of a sudden they achieve it and they just get so excited. Also, even though diving is an individual sport, the team atmosphere is huge. We are one of the only sports, I think, that actually wants their competition to succeed and do really well. So you can be in the middle of a meet, and even though you want to win and do the best, you also want your competition to win and do the best. Like, you are so excited when your teammates do well, when your opponents do well, and it's because there's that positive atmosphere. So if someone does a great dive, everyone cheers and everyone gets excited. It's not like, oh, I want to beat them, so I'm really mad that they did well. You're excited for the sport to succeed and do well, which I think is something that is just so unique about diving, and that you don't see that. You're not going to see a football team get excited when another football team gets a touchdown. But if my competition ends up doing a great dive, I'll cheer and scream and get really excited for them, which is just one of the really exciting things about this sport. I would say the hard thing is because it is such a small niche sport. It makes it a little bit tough to, I guess, get recognition and things. But it also is a sport that can be biased at times, which is unfortunate. If you're an athlete, you get judged from the second you walk on that pool deck, unfortunately. So if you see athletes that are being rude, disrespectful, slapping the water around, just causing a temper tantrum or something like that, when you're judging, you may subconsciously be like, oh, I want to give them a 4 versus a 5, you'll give them a 4. Where if you have an athlete who is just, doing well, really sweet, really nice, subconsciously you might end up scoring them a little higher. We also run into an issue sometimes with judging when it's the person's expected to win. You might give them more of the benefit of the doubt, like, oh yeah, normally they do that better. As opposed to athletes, you might not ever have seen an athlete before and they're doing really well. They might not actually get scored as high. And I don't think it's an intentional bias that judges have, but I think it's something that subconsciously happens every now and then, which can definitely cause some problems. And then I also think most of the time diving community is really good and that everyone wants to support and help each other. But there are definitely some instances where people are like, that's my athlete, you can't help them, or that's my athlete. And I think sometimes that we run into that. But for the most part, our community is a really great community where coaches are like, oh, you should teach them this, or you should show them that. And that's, I think, something that you don't find in a lot of other sports.
Mhm. I want to come back to the judging in a minute. We did get a question in the chat box from James, and he was asking about promotional advertising and partnering with the NIL. Do divers get NIL contracts and endorsements in the NCAA yet?
I think there are some. I'll be honest, I'm not actually sure who has any at the moment. It is a newer thing, which is really exciting because that was definitely something that I think would have benefited and helped a lot of divers, because there are scholarships out there, but there's not a whole lot of them, especially in men's diving. There are not a lot of scholarship for male divers. So some people might not actually be able to go to schools that they want to go to because they just can't afford to go to them. And so having that opportunity to get scholarships would be great. But I don't actually know any specific divers, but I'm sure there are some out there just because of the way social media works and everything. There's got to be a handful of them.
Why are males less likely to get scholarships than females?
It just comes with the funding that a lot of programs have. So Title IX has been a phenomenal thing for athletic programs and colleges, but unfortunately, sometimes that means that the smaller programs and colleges do get cut. So if they're trying to figure out budgeting or trying to figure out how to keep Title IX balanced, because football is included in Title IX, I think sometimes that makes it a little bit harder for certain schools.
Mhm.
Swimming and diving is that sport that gets cut a lot. You'll see that men's gymnastics gets cut a lot, and diving does. So even if is a men's team, they might not get the funding. So when I was at Western Kentucky, I think we had a bunch of girls scholarships, and then we had like 2 or 3 men's scholarships. It's just, you either don't see as many scholarships out there, or you just don't even see the teams in general. So when they're looking to cut teams, they're going to cut them from those non-revenue sports because we just don't make the schools any money. We end up losing the schools money, unfortunately, and we just don't see the funding from it.
Mhm. I got another question to give you in the chat box, but first, let's just take a quick break and we'll do a quick commercial. The mission of FSU Coach is to prepare and equip the next generation of coaches and sports professionals with best practices and current research to enable them to pursue excellence.
We have 2 academic programs, the online graduate certificate, which is 4 classes, and also a 10-class master's in athletic coaching. Our graduate certificate and master's program can be started at any time, either the summer, fall, or spring. All of our classes have the word coach or coaching in them, and they're taught by coaches for coaches.
The types of classes that we offer focus on the athlete as a whole person. We focus on the theory and practice, the research, the helping skills, even some of the mental performance behind, what it goes into being an athlete. I came to FSU Coach because I truly believed in the mission and the purpose of the program.
I think I have my dream job being a head coach at Florida State, but I know there's always more ways that I can help my athletes and better prepare as a coach, so I thought joining this master's program would help me learn different ways to attack my job. If you're interested in going into coaching or joining the FSU Coach program, I would just say don't even think about it and do it.
And we're back. Question in the chat box comes from Belford. He says, if the sport is expensive to be part of, what are the intentional things that you've seen to spread the notoriety of the sport to prospective divers from lower SES statuses? Or have you?
So that is actually one thing that I'm really interested in doing, and it's one of the things that sort of made me want to start getting my PhD, was figuring out how to sort of help diversify the sport. We are seeing it a little bit more. I know that when I was coaching in tomahawk diving in Tallahassee, we worked with certain athletes and maybe gave them like a little bit of a discount, charged them a little bit cheaper to be able to get them into the sport based on whatever their financial issues were or wherever they were standing. We also do a lot of fundraisers. So if you're able to fundraise, you can get money that can help sort of offset the cost for that. Moultrie, Georgia actually has a phenomenal program where they work with grocery stores and they get athletes or to be sponsored. So they actually bus kids from schools to come try diving for like a PE class. They just sort of get to experience it. And then these grocery stores actually sort of help pay for certain athletes. If these athletes feel like this is something that they want to do, they're going to be really good at it. If they show potential, these grocery stores sort of sponsor these athletes and pay their way through the program. And it's just a really interesting thing I've actually never seen anywhere else. Like I said, I actually started coaching when I was 14, and that paid for my diving. So my coach at the time was really nice, and he said, if you help me coach the lessons program, we won't charge you for you to dive in the program. And that was a really nice way for us to do it. So I kind of tried to do the same thing where we want to help support people. So if we can fundraise, if we can get money to help offset the cost. What I do with my program too is a lot of programs you have to pay coaches fees and you have to pay for the coaches travel. Instead, we did fundraising. And so we came up with a whole bunch of fundraisers that made it so that no one ever had to pay for my travel, and that our boosters instead paid for my travel to competitions. And that helped offset the cost a lot for those families. But I do think that as a sport, we need to do a much better job of trying to find ways to get people from different socioeconomic classes or to be able to participate, because it is one of those sports where you see a lot less people from those different, especially with how expensive meets are. You find people that are able to come to practice and come to whatever your club team is, but they're not able to travel to competitions just because it is so expensive for them to do that.
Another question also from James then says, what are your thoughts of disability athletes in swimming and diving? Do they have coaches out there willing to help and work with them? It's a good question.
That is a really good question. I actually think that there are a lot of programs that are able to work with those type of athletes. You just have to find the right coaches. I will say in the lessons program we had at Tomahawk Diving, we had a handful of kids that had some type of disability or some type of thing that it might make it a little bit harder for them to participate in other sports. And people are like, oh, diving doesn't seem like that right sport. But if you have the right coaches that can work with those athletes, understand their needs, understand how to communicate with them, understand whatever it is that they might need, you can make any athlete successful. And success depends on what they're looking for. You know, it might just be to get out and to participate and do something. It might be that they want to win, but it is a sport that is dangerous. So you have to make sure you have the right people in place. But we are able to do it. You just have to find coaches that are willing to take the time to do it. I definitely know there are some coaches out there that will do it, and there's some that are going to say that this is not the right sport for you. But there are a handful of athletes out there that can participate. And as long as they have the, like I said, as long as they have the right coaches who understand their needs, then you can do anything, and give the kid the success that they want to have, regardless, whatever that success might be.
I want to go back to judging. You don't know this, but I was a nutritional counselor for the Arkansas Razorbacks many years ago, and swimming and diving were part of the group that I worked with. So I would go to diving meets and watch, and I would watch some suspects scoring. We'll put it that way, where the scoring was done by coaches, which I couldn't believe, that coaches of their own players were scoring each other, having a chat while they held up their scorecards. And then after talking with some of the divers, yeah, sometimes the scoring's a little bit skewed because we know we need such and such score to get to nationals or something like that. And I just, no way, this is an NCAA sport. How is this happening? Has that changed since I was involved? Is judging more rigorous, or does it remain one of those contentious things where winning and losing is often just the opinion of somebody or some bodies who, as you already alluded to, may be biased in some way?
So there's different kinds of judging, and I know this sounds weird, but there's different levels of competition, and there's different ways that those get judged. So when you're looking at junior Olympic diving, so if you're looking at coaching for little kids, you typically have either 3, 5, or 7 judges. So if you have 3 judges, all 3 scores stay. If you have 5, the high and the low stay. And if you have 7, I'm sorry, the high and the low leave, and the 3 middle stay. And then if you have 7, the 2 high and the 2 low leave. And it's always going to be the coaches who are judging. And a lot of times it's actually a little bit more fair when you're looking at like USA diving across the board in that sense, because they're really not necessarily trying to get their athletes to win or do specific things. For the most part, it's pretty fair. You then have high school diving, which is basically people who are coaching that a lot of times don't actually know the sport very well. They might be teachers, they might be swim coaches, they might be parents. And that high school diving, judging is kind of a joke. It's one of the reasons that I always hated doing high school diving was not because of the actual athletes. It was just you get these people who didn't understand the sport, or they would judge like, oh, that looked really cool, but they're not paying attention to the actual way you're supposed to judge. So you'd have like a 3 and an 8, and you're like, that doesn't make any sense. You know, the dive should be X, Y, or Z. And so that can be very frustrating at times because you will see in high school diving these crazy outliers. And then in college diving, when you're looking at just the dual meets are 2 teams. So there's only 2 coaches at those teams, or like at those meets. So you're basically having both of the coaches judge. And then because it's not 3 judges, you're multiplying the score by 1.5. Some college coaches are phenomenal coaches, phenomenal ethical people. And you do find some coaches that they want their divers to qualify for NCAA zones, which is based on a score, or they want their athletes to win because it gives the school more points. And so you find some of those dual meet competitions where the judging is very fair. But that was one of the things I hated about coaching college, was that sometimes you're just like, that was not the proper score. But then if I give someone a 4 and you give them an 8, I look like I'm really mean. Or vice versa. If I'm like, no, that was a phenomenal dive, 8, and you give them a 4, I look like I'm being biased. And you definitely have that a lot in college diving, which is very unfortunate. But those are just the dual meets. Once you get to the higher levels, like NCAA zones or NCAAs, or when you get to USA Diving Nationals, we actually bring in outside judges that have been FINA certified. And so they are judges that go through a rigorous training. They actually have this whole class they have to take. They get certified. And those judges are supposed to be non-biased judges. And they're the ones that kind of come in. They don't have any athletes that are participating, and they're the ones that get to judge those events. So it does become a lot more official. And actually, those judges don't get invited back if they are a lot of an outlier. So if everyone's scoring someone a 5 and they keep scoring them an 8, or going the other direction, then they won't be asked to come back again. But it is tough because some competitions are very, very fair. And you can see it, you're like, okay, all the judges are the same. And then other ones, you can see that you're just like, that's kind of skewed, and that's not really the way that should have been judged.
Yeah, judging is such a unique situation in sports. And of course, we have officials who also have to make judgments in games, but not like this. And
Mhm.
your gymnastics, we could look at some of the winter sports as well, where judging is given, where it is human opinion after all. And anyway, interesting discussion. Thank you for sharing that. Another question in the chat, Belford again, is being tall, if being taller is good for basketball players, what body types are more desirable for ideal divers? I understand that there's always exceptions, but generally, what would you say? I recently found out from our gymnasts that pole vaulting is a great sport that's easy for them to transition into because both sports involve flexibility and having awareness with your body in space. Is there a sport that works hand in hand with diving that would make it easier to transition into diving?
So I think the ideal body type for diving has sort of transitioned over the years. When I was an athlete a long time ago, the mentality was fat, don't flip. So you were supposed to be skinny and lean, and you were not supposed to have any curves at all. If you are a platform diver, especially, so I was a tower diver, the platform divers are supposed to be a little bit more tall, skinny, very lean because it's a little bit more graceful, where springboard divers are supposed to be a little bit stronger. I do think that that has changed a little bit. The mentality is not fat, don't flip anymore. And people are actually understanding that muscle is really important to have and that you want to be strong and powerful because to do those harder dives, you need to be strong. Now, being about 7 feet tall, that might be really hard for diving. But I would say, just an average human height is probably pretty good. But springboard divers typically will have like a little bit more strength just because they have to hold the diving board down to get a little bit more power out of it. And tower divers are going to be a little bit leaner, but either way, you basically want to be able to have a lot more fast twitch muscles. So those muscles that can kind of help you explode and fire, flip faster, things like that are good. Gymnastics is the perfect sport to transition back and forth between because both sports, you have a lot of that air awareness. You know how to flip your body. You are able to be flexible and strong. The only really downfall between gymnastics and diving is diving, we land on our hands or our head, and gymnastics, you land on your feet. So the transition from gymnastics to diving can be tough because people aren't sure how to land on their hands. Just like when you go from diving to gymnastics, it can be a little bit harder to land on your feet sometimes. But I do think that we are transitioning into being a stronger sport, but you still want to be very lean and agile because you have to move your body around pretty well.
One thought occurred to me, perhaps shorter athletes would be better in diving because they can do more turns before the space runs out between the platform and the water. Is that because you mentioned the 7 footer, and I thought, well, if they do one somersault, that covers a lot of height, right? So they can't physically do as many before they
Mhm.
hit the water. Am I way off base here?
No, so athletes who are small, like shorter and smaller, are typically able to spin and get into a smaller tuck or pike just because there's a lot less resistance against the air. So if I'm really tall, then there's going to be a lot more air resistance there. Where if I'm smaller, then you can get a lot more compact. You will find that taller athletes are a little bit more of those graceful, pretty athletes, where the ones that are shorter, they might be able to spin faster. So there's pros and cons to both because with the sport of diving, you want to be able to do really hard dives, but you also want to make them look very graceful. And so there is definitely a balance. But I will say, yeah, most divers who are a little bit shorter are able to get a little bit more compact and spin a little bit faster.
All right, just starting to wrap up here. Think back to coaching and what you've done and who you've worked with and so on. If somebody wants to get into coaching diving, what advice do you have for them? What do they need to know that you feel is important for them to be successful?
I think coaching diving or coaching any sport is really important to understand that every athlete learns differently. There's not a one size fits all mentality. It's important to understand that some athletes learn by doing, some learn by seeing, some learn by feeling or getting shown those motions. Also, some athletes you need to coddle them and treat them a little bit nicer, and some athletes you need to be a little bit more stern with. And I think that that's one of the biggest things of advice I could give to any coach, regardless what the sport is, just because it is so different and unique when you want to get the best out of each of your athletes to know how to train them differently. So there's not a one size fits all mentality. When I coach diving, every single athlete has a different program every single day from a different person. Like none of them are doing the exact same thing because it needs to be tailored towards their skill set, their wants, their needs, their goals, their body, just their mentality. So if I'm really strict with you and really stern with you, I might need to, it's okay, you got this, you're going to be all right. And then someone else need to be like, you need to go right now. But I also think it's important to have a general thing that is everyone has the same goals and expectations. So you don't treat any athlete different when it comes to those things. So you're on time, you work hard, you're a positive role model, whatever it might be. But then if your athletes aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing, they know what the expectations are. It's not like, oh, well, Chelsea's nicer to this athlete and Chelsea's meaner to me and Chelsea lets them be late, but not me be late. So I think when it comes to coaching, it's a different thing depending on the athlete. But I think when it comes to your overall rules of your program, it needs to be exact same standards, regardless if you're the best athlete on the team or the not as good athlete on the team. And then as far as the sport of diving, physics is actually incredibly important to learn. Understanding how physics works, you wouldn't think it, but it's really beneficial for diving. And I would take a lot of time to sort of watch YouTube videos, take coaching classes, talk to other coaches, and really take the time to talk to people who have been in the environment. The best way to learn how to coach the sport of diving is to work with other coaches who have done it, because they can give you advice on what went well, what hasn't gone well, what might work for different things. So one athlete might be struggling and one piece of advice might help them, but that might not help another athlete. So coaching and working with other coaches just gives you a lot more knowledge and education. And that is, like I said before, one of the nice things about the sport is most coaches really want to help the sport and help each other. So I would just encourage you to talk to as many diving coaches as you possibly can.
It's great advice. Now, we put these into a podcast and on YouTube later. So if people do watch later and they have a question for you, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
Feel free to email me at any time. You can email me on my FSU email address, and I would be happy to get back to you and answer whatever questions you might have.
And for those listening to the podcast, that is CLA10C at fsu.edu, CLA10C at fsu.edu. Well, Chelsea, thank you so much for sharing a little bit of your expertise, and I do hope people reach out to you with more questions. Just a reminder, everybody, we try to do these interviews once every couple of weeks, so be sure to subscribe to YouTube or the podcast wherever you're watching or listening. But on behalf of myself, Tim Baghurst, and Chelsea L., thanks so much for watching.
Thank you.